I met you a couple years ago at an academic conference, and you handed me a book, and I'm like, what in the world is that? Oh, you have it with you?
Yes, I handed you
here's
this book.
That's the one.
Right here.
Barack Obama versus the, what's the rest of it?
Barack Obama versus the Black Hebrew Israelites. Introduction to the History and Beliefs of One West Hebrew Israelism.
Okay, so I looked at that and I thought, what is a Black Hebrew Israelite? So I didn't know anything about it. I mean, having read a good, probably most of that, and then some stuff online.
Okay.
I have a bit of an idea, but why don't you tell our viewers, like, where did this topic come from? Because growing up, I never heard about this. I never even heard the term.
Right.
So what is this? Where does this come from?
Well, the specific title I have is there's a brief scene in a brief little movie they made on Barack Obama's young life, and he has a little miniature debate on the streets of Harlem with some Hebrew Israelites, and I said that's a great title, to kind of use that.
So there's
scene.
an actual video of him debating
the actor portraying him. It's called Barry. It was a Netflix movie.
Okay.
So did that exact thing happen? Don't know.
Right.
But he did walk from. I mapped it out. Actually, it's kind of nerdy, but where his apartment was to where Columbia was, and he would have had to gone by. If he took, where they were commonly were. Okay. So it's very possible, likely. I don't know if the scriptwriters had any inside information, but that's where it came from. I said that's a great scene. Like, here's a young Obama being an apologist. I say this slightly in jest, but it's an interesting thing. That's where it comes from. But that gets even to where their origins are primarily is in New York City. Okay. Because that's where he was. And 1969, as far as the brand or faction or style of Hebrew Israelism we're discussing, is sort of their official start date. But you've got to go back to the late 1880s and 1890s to see when you see the first people coming out saying, we've heard the songs, the spirituals, about us identifying sort of spiritually with the slaves in the Hebrew Bible. Right. We are literally the people of the Hebrew Bible. We are the actual Hebrews.
So it began with them, because, we've all heard Negro spirituals, maybe we've seen the Ken Burns, series on the Civil War, or know, frankly, a little bit about the history of our own country. So, there's this strong connection between the, slave population of the South, identifying spiritually with the Hebrew, the Hebrews in Egypt in bondage. But you're saying it transitions then to something literal.
Right. Now, a Hebrew Israelite apologist, if he were here, would say, no, that's sort of a latent memory or something like that we knew we were these people or something like that. That's how they would spin it.
So the slave population in the South, they were having a latent memory of something that was much older.
Not that they knew, but they sort of knew, kind of, like that kind of thing. And that's why these songs come out. It's like, that kind of thing. But you can sort of see the transition go from metaphorical to literal. One of the first guys is a guy named Crowdy, Crowdy. He says why he's chopping at the root of a tree. He has this vision, and the vision entails that Black Americans are the true Jews of the Bible. Before that, there's a guy named F.S. Cherry. So the actual name of the oldest church, it's kind of long, so I got to pick this up to read it. The Church of the Living God, the pillar and ground of truth for all nations, founded in 1886 in Tennessee by Prophet F.S. Cherry. And if you notice, you saw in there, of all nations, and then Crowdy also had a lot of white followers. The reason why I mention that is the 1969 strand on that we're speaking of denies the inclusion of other nations. And so it's a more exclusivist, based upon your ethnic background, strand of Hebrew Israelism than even the initial founders. Right. And there's a broader Hebrew Israelism that's not as exclusive.
So you're saying the Black Hebrew Israelite, for lack of a better term, movement that we might see on TV today is actually like a totally exclusive. They would disown this kind of thing that you just mentioned, that there were white people.
They like to have it both ways. So, for example, here's the group called IUIC, Israel United in Christ. There might be about 6,000 members now and growing, and they're doing mission trips to Ghana and Uganda and all that. IUIC has a little timeline history on their website, and they include Crowdy and try to connect what they're doing to Crowdy and F.S. Cherry, and even go back further, Nat Turner, things like that. But if you look at what they're doing, it's limited off. It says, no, we're the true Jews and we're the true Hebrews, And not only can other nations not be grafted in, they're going to be our slaves in the kingdom. And maybe we can talk about their eschatology later on. But it is a more militant, for lack of a better word, strand. And you mentioned who we might see on TV. So if people remember the Covington High School kids wearing the MAGA hats during the different marches that were happening in D.C., and they ran into a group called the House of Israel. And those guys are One Westers, meaning they come out of the school called One West, which that's the 1969 date I mentioned. That's when that school began. They were coming up against some of the most, they're coming up with the most militant form of Hebrew Israelism that exists. But that's most likely what you see on the street corner if you go out in a major population center. The more mainstream or moderate so-called Hebrew Israelites tend to do things more like conferences and videos. They don't do as much street evangelism as the more militant guys.
So you, I mean, again, for lack of a better term, it's sort of a fundamentalistic approach, you know, as opposed to, like you said, the more mainstream.
Yes.
Okay, so what happens between the late 1800s and 1969? I mean, what are the factions developing then, or do they just sort of emerge later on?
In 1899, you also have something called the Moorish Zionist Temple in Brooklyn, and then 1919, this is the big one, the Commandment Keepers, founded in Harlem, which is really the headquarters of all this, by Wentworth Arthur Matthew. And there was a man there who was involved with the Commandment Keepers. And even think about their name, you sense right away.
Something to do with Torah.
Yeah, and if you look at old pictures of the Commandment Keepers, it looks like what people basically call Black Judaism or Black Jews. There's it's clear they're holding Torah scrolls and even sometimes interacting with mainstream rabbis. Sometimes some of them are learning Hebrew from that. Abba Bivens was a man who was at this school. Abba Bivens was originally from the South and then came up to New York and says he was told by an ex-slave that our people are actually the true Hebrews. Then he gets involved with the Commandment Keepers. The dates are a little unclear exactly when this happened, but gets involved with the Commandment Keepers congregation and is there a while. Abba's not his real name, as you can imagine, but that's how he's called in literature. And you can find pictures of him being involved with the Commandment Keepers and all that. He left the school, though, and it's said because there was a dissatisfaction with sort of a lack of any kind of New Testament and perhaps messianic nod, although it's unclear his own feelings on that, because when he first began, it was a real hybrid. Like, what exactly is his position on Jesus as Messiah? What exactly is his position on New Testament? And so that it took a while to develop away from Tanakh-only Hebrew Israelism. That's what they like to call it. They don't like to call it non-messianic. They like to call it Tanakh-only Hebrew Israelism, into a messianic kind of Hebrew Israelism, which is the One Westers do accept the New Testament, and they do accept, they say, Jesus as Messiah. And so most of the groups we're talking about today do say they hold to the New Testament, which makes their position even more offensive, to be honest, and more untenable.
Yeah, I would think it would be more difficult if you include the New Testament in that. So, okay, for the sake of the viewers, so we have this transition at some point between, the slave population of the South, sort of conceptually or metaphorically identifying with the Hebrew slaves in the Bible who were in bondage. At some point, the idea comes along that, hey, and again, this first guy you mentioned, it was a vision or something like that.
Crowdy, one of the first guys, Crowdy.
And aren't they all? That's typically where this kind of thing happens. But they transition into something more literal. That hey, we actually are, their descendants. These are our ancestors. In a literal sense. And so some are Jewish only. Again, Torah, Tanakh only, and others incorporate the New Testament. So let's circle back to, I guess, in a way of today. But if you encounter one of these groups again on the street, chances are it's which group again? Of
the One West variety. Now, if you say, are you a One Wester? They may not even know what you're saying, because a lot of these guys getting involved don't even know their own history. And some will actually say, I've run into groups that say, we're not a One Wester. And then I'll say, well, do you embrace the 12 tribes of Israel chart, which is a One West distinctive? That's a specific thing to One West. And they'll say yes. And I'll say, well, do you embrace Lashawn Kadash? That's their own version of Hebrew, which is not really Hebrew at all. And they say yes. I say, do you embrace the Gentile 18 nations chart, which is another, these are distinctive.
These are like documents.
And they'll say yes. Okay. And it's like, well, you're a One Wester. It's like someone saying I'm not a Calvinist and they embrace all 5 points of Calvinism. Well, what are you then? So imagine One West as, to use that metaphor, as Calvinistic thought or Reformed theology, but then there's the Presbyterian Church of America, the Orthodox Presbyterian Church, the Reformed Baptist, different denominations.
Different expressions of it. Yeah.
So within Hebrew Israelism, One Westism, there's different camps. Rough analogy for a denomination. So I mentioned the House of Israel camp. I've already mentioned the Israel United in Christ camp. The main school that was One West turned into a camp called the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ. So it's most likely if you run into someone, you run into a One Wester, and usually if someone's on the phone, like, hey, I just saw these guys on the corner, Vocab, who are they? I say, tell me what they're wearing. And 80% of the time I can figure out who they are by what they're wearing. For example, Israel United in Christ, the biggest camp I mentioned, wears distinctive purple and gold, and sometimes capes as well. GMS, the Great Millstone Israelites, they don't have any uniform look. They tend to throw what appears to be like smocks over their normal clothes. Other groups have different colors. ISUPK usually wears black, and they wear a lot of spikes. So I heard one friend say they look kind of like a medieval biker gang. That's the look of the ISUPK. That stands for the Israelite School of Universal Practical Knowledge. So you can usually tell by actually even some of the dress. Now, there's new camps popping up every day. So every day I find some new camp I've never heard of. It is impossible to catalog this stuff. It is growing that fast.
So how do they get along with each other? Or
okay, so
does it transcend competition to actual like violence or anything? Or
so there's some, you asked about violence, I'll start there. There's a few examples of actual showdowns between some of the camps. There's a few stories about that. By and large, it usually doesn't. As far as any kind of mass scale, by and large, it does not. On the surface, they'll say we're all, calling each other, we're all doing our part to wake our people up to the fact they're Israelites on the surface. But yeah, there is a lot of competition and dissing each other's doctrines because they treat almost everything as if it's an essential.
Okay, yeah.
So it's almost like they're genetically modified to fracture, meaning it's like they're almost, by the nature of a lot of the leaders and how they hold on to smaller issues as absolute fundamentals, they end up breaking a lot of times and splitting. This happened a lot in the 90s. So people that study this movement, we call the 90s era of this the fractured 90s because they really fell apart. And it came to a head in 1999 when Ariah, who was a leader of the school at the time, had a prophecy, which you could probably guess what it is, and it goes all the way back to F.S. Cherry, who also predicted Jesus would come back in the year 2000. They don't call him Jesus, they call him Yahushai in their language. Yahushai did not come back in 2000, and the way they get out of that is say, well, Jonah's prophecy didn't come true with the 40 days. That's how they get out of it.
Yeah.
A lot of groups do this. But that caused further division, and a lot of people left at that time when that prophecy did not come true.
Last question as far as the history goes for our episode, for this episode anyway, we're going to be bringing you back to do some more things because this is a pretty deep rabbit hole, this whole subject. But what's the strategy for getting converts, if that's even an acceptable word to them? I mean,
I'll say the word convert.
Okay.
They like to say, he gets awoken to the truth or wake up or something like that.
All right. And so how are they growing? What are the means? So
street preaching is a way. And a lot of people say there's no way that could be working, but they're not in the right mentality to understand Hebrew Israelism. So imagine maybe the community's in chaos and maybe a lot of things are always changing, but yet every single Saturday when you go to catch the bus, there's these guys out here with Bibles every Saturday for 4 hours at a time, saying things from the Bible and getting rejected and laughed at every single Saturday. They go, and I've seen this literally happen on certain corners where the crowd's response transforms to one of clear annoyance to respect, as these are sort of the prophets of the block. I've seen this happen. So it's like almost by the sheer consistency of them being out there, a lot of times they grow and gain respect. Clearly, there's still people who are irritated by them. As you can see, some of the camps purposely do that. Someone will walk by and they'll call them a slur or say, you're going to go into change, stuff like that, or, they're always yelling. But that's one way. But you can never underestimate YouTube. Their videos, their output is rather prolific, and even if people don't go and become one-westers, the one-westers are probably the most prolific in video content production, just non-stop. GMS tends to have lower quality videos. Some people appreciate that. IUIC has polished videos, things on the screen. Each episode has a really fancy cover image, crazy Jezebel woman versus the prophets of God. It's like a little almost cinematic piece the way they do it. There'll be 20 minutes of their time they were out there. So they become, some of them are rather savvy in how they do this, but that's a big thing. And now they're actually going block to block. I live where a lot of this happens because I live in the city. I was leaving a certain place the other day, and I was driving down, and I'm trying not to give all the exact names of places, but anyways, they were at an apartment complex handing out flyers. They're just, and so they're getting into more kind of traditional door-to-door stuff now. Books are a small part of it, but really, it's really videos is the key. That's the key of how people do this. Every now and then it's from a street encounter, but videos you can't underestimate their importance.
All right. Yeah, something else just popped into my head. Who are they handing the flyers out to? Because I know it's not just, black or African American. Is it only minorities that would be included in their group, or do they hand them out to white people?
So the way they do it is basically if they can look at you and your phenotype, your stereotypical facial features matches someone on their 12 tribes chart.
Then you'll get a flyer.
Then you get a flyer. Okay. So black, Native American, Hispanic, those three groups.
Okay.
But then they want to ask you who your father is. So if you're Hispanic on your mother's side, but your father was, say, Arabic, you're not on the 12 tribes chart because your father is not on the chart.
Okay.
And so if they see
it seems like the chart is indispensable then.
To the one Westers, it is indispensable. To the one Westers, it isn't, because it tells you who to proselytize and who to condemn.
Okay.
And so it is important. And it's not just white folks who are sort of on the, Ixnay list. It's also, I mentioned Arabs are viewed as Ishmaelites and condemned. Yeah. Chinese, this is laughable, but they're viewed as Moabites and condemned. Japanese are viewed as Ammonites.
Sorry, it is laughable.
It is. It's extremely laughable. Japanese are viewed as Ammonites and they're condemned. I could go down a whole list. Indians, East Indians, are Elamites, I believe, they're condemned. And so each ancient biblical nation, they look for a modern corresponding people group to, and then they condemn them based upon that. And there's 18 total nations that they condemn, and it's not just white people who they would call Edomites. It's 17 others as well.
Okay. Wow, that's really interesting. I mean, it's disturbing and interesting at the same time, but most of what we do on the show here is disturbing and interesting.
Real quick thing, they have a classic way to what scholars sometimes call other people.
Okay.
They other them and then put them in this sort of basket of the other, and then they're off limits. They're not even candidates for salvation. The only thing they're candidates for, to the one Westers, is slavery. Okay. And within slavery, they sometimes make jokes. Some, if you're a good Edomite or a good Ishmaelite, you're a candidate to be a house slave instead of a field slave. And I'm not joking. Right.
Wow, well, we're going to have to continue the discussion, because I'm going to want to know, and I'm sure the viewers are going to want to know, how do they defend this? And that's what we'll do next time. We have Vocab Malone back with us, and we're talking about Black Hebrew Israelites. And what I want to get into this time is, what are the core doctrinal beliefs of this group? So their theology, what is it that they believe that we ought to know about?
Well, I've got a little list here.
A whole list, like a systematic theology, okay.
Although I don't know if we could use the word systematic, but yeah, something like that. So the first thing is presupposition that then matters for later on, which is the physical lineage of all peoples has significant theological implications.
Okay.
In short, what ethnic group you're born into matters in God's sight. It has ecclesiastical implications, it has eschatological implications, and it, most important, I think, has salvific implications.
Right, so it's almost like elect and non-elect based on your physical lineage.
Yes. Okay. I would describe the 12 tribes chart of Israel that the One West Hebrew Israelites use as these are potentially elect peoples, and the 18 nations chart as the non-elect peoples.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we should mention too that if that term, the chart, is not familiar to viewers, they can watch the previous episode. So what else?
Secondly, most descendants whose ancestors were subject to the unjust horrors of the transatlantic slave trade are the true Israelites. I saw a meme one time that said, if you came over here on a slave ship, you're an Israelite. That's sort of the simple way to say it.
Right.
But since we're talking about One West Hebrew Israelism, the 12 tribes chart also includes Native Americans, and it also includes Hispanics. Interestingly enough, you have this religion, and they make a big deal out. Christianity is a Roman white pagan thing. This is truly for our people. Mm-hmm. But here's what's interesting, Mike. When you look at the chart, you have Judah. Judah is the so-called Black Americans. The Benjamites are like Jamaicans and folks in that region. Mm-hmm. And pretty much the rest of the chart, for the most part, is composed of basically peoples not of African descent. Meaning, on the 12 tribes chart, black folks are actually a minority on the chart that they've created. You know what I mean? Because the other groups are Zebulon, and you've got Cuba and Simeon and Issachar, Mexican.
They were brought over on some kind of boat, but in reality, they actually outnumber.
Yes, but not as far as actual adherence. I sometimes will maybe, because they believe that they've got to get the right amount to equal 144,000 from each tribe. And so, for example, Gad are said to be the Native Americans, and yet Reuben are Seminoles, meaning you have one solitary Native American tribe pulled out from the people, some of who are actually their ancestors, so it's kind of weird, Muskogee Creek, pulled out and left alone here as Seminoles are Reuben, and yet all the other Native Americans are Gad. Sometimes they'll say, how many Seminoles have you guys converted? How many Seminoles, if you need 12,000, how many Seminoles do you have right now? The Seminole inclusion as Reuben, I think, is on a rather weak chart, the weakest link of all.
It's really odd. Okay, so can you give us another one? Is there another point?
Yes, there certainly are. Virtually all modern day Jews, to them I'll put it in scare quotes, are religious and ethnic imposters. They're frauds. Jews are not Jews, they're actually Amalekites.
So the land of Israel is populated by imposters.
They love to say, if we're not the people of the book, who is? Those crackers over there in Israel? Right. They love to say that. They love to ask it that way.
Yeah.
And here's some of their lines of evidence. They'll say they're successful, they control everything. That doesn't look like the people of the book who are going to experience these curses for disobedience. And they'll say, how could this be the people of God? Don't you know that one of the biggest gay pride parades happens every year in Israel? This can't be the people of God.
That really strikes me as odd as well, because that almost seems like an argument for keeping the black or African American population in this country impoverished, so that they sort of fit the template. Because if they become prosperous, then they don't fit the template anymore. Like, do they lose their elect status or something?
Well, they would say, don't you remember Israel under David and Solomon? They were successful because they were keeping the laws of the Most High. And so we don't want to stay in this condition. But it's very interesting, because this religion basically wanted to be a theodicy, but it turned into blaming God for the whole evils of the transatlantic slave trade. That's what ends up happening on it, because it had to happen as their punishment. It was
a judgment,
for disobedience.
Yeah.
And so now what they're saying is we're waking our people up, and a lot of the groups have nation somewhere in either in their literature or actually in their name. There's a group in LA called the True Nation. And so they think they're nation building when they wake people up, and that's why some of their titles are not just elder and deacon, they're general and captain.
Okay, there's something confusing me here. So if they're going to use the Torah, where let's just go with their view here, so that you've got a bunch of black people who are actually the Hebrews, and they're enslaved in Egypt, and according to the biblical story, they are delivered, they're taken out of bondage, brought to the promised land and all that sort of stuff. So that would seem like they were awakened. So why would God punish a group of them later in the slave trade? Like, why would God do that?
You're saying, why would he punish a group of, well...
In other words, if this group, if what we think of as the Israelites or the Hebrews were black, and they're in Egypt, and God takes them out of Egypt, to Sinai and the promised land, just the simple biblical story, why do we get a subsequent group of them punished in the slave trade?
Well,
I mean, it seems like if you're forgiven and delivered once, why are you? I mean,
the curses are perpetual.
Is it the exile thing? They link this to the exile.
They like to say the curses are perpetual,
Okay.
and so they might point to, say, Judges, where there's a cycle of oppression, and then God raises up a judge, and there's deliverance, and then there's success, and then people fall back into sin, and then the cycle gets repeated for 400 or so years. They might say that's what happens, and they will use some of the New Testament language, well, it's prophetic language, of a stiff-necked people as well. They'll speak about that, or hardened hearts.
It may not work itself out in actual slavery, but it could be some other unfavorable situation, some perceived exile, something like that sort of makes the subsequent populations fit this template.
Yeah, and not only that, but when you talk about 70, or even what happened after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, they'll say the result was not just these punishments for sin and the dispersion that happened of Israel throughout the four corners. It's also forgetting who she is, not actually remembering, because that's why it needs to be an awakening happen, and to tell people who they are. So sometimes the street preaching is, hey, don't you know who you are? Your ancestors are written about in this book. You have a royal destiny, things like that.
So in some sense, this is linked to the old, lost tribes kind of thinking as well.
Yes.
The old British Israelism stuff, and except, obviously those two things are incompatible, the British Israelism and the black Hebrew Israelites.
Anglo-Israelism beat the Hebrew Israelites of the stripe we're talking about by about 100 years, about a century. And some of the arguments are literally flipped on their head or repurposed. Just one quick example. They used to say British. If you go into the Hebrew, you've got the word for covenant, and then ish, the word for man. So British is covenant man. This shows that the land of Britain is populated by covenant men. The Hebrew Israelites teach, and this is not a joke, what I'm about to tell you. This is not a fundamental belief, but this is part of their alt history. The Dark Ages are called the Dark Ages because a black aristocratic class ruled Europe. And so, as evidence for that, they point to the name of Britain, or the British peoples, as saying it's evident we were there and in charge because the name is a leftover remnant. You have covenant man there. They use the same exact argument.
So you had like Caucasians steal that designation or something like that.
Yeah, like they steal everything.
Yeah, okay.
That would be the way they would think about it. Like this, and King James was one of the very last black aristocratic rulers of the Dark Ages. King James was black.
But that's not even the Dark Ages, though.
They have to stretch it to King. I know it's not.
They have to stretch it by almost 1,000.
I know it's not, but so they're not. The reason I'm saying it that way is to let you know they think King James is black, but also they have to do that because they use the King James version of the Bible. And they can't have a white guy being in charge of it.
Oh, that's very odd. Okay, what else? No, it is. It's really odd.
So all modern day Jews are imposters, they believe. They believe they're Khazars by and large, but who are actually Amalekites. Yeah, long story. And then fourthly, I have on here, just it has a little bit to do more with praxis, just to note the nature of it is that it's highly, it's a system of syncretism. It blends elements of Judaism, of New Testament Christianity, and even sometimes some other things as far as for the practice, and really even to a certain extent beliefs. And that's part of the reason why it's troubling or damaging, meaning if Hebrew Israelism only entailed, here's what I think my ancestors were, or something like that, that wouldn't be such a big deal. But it's like an anchor that weighs everything else down. And then when a person who was a professing Christian gets into it, they start off as, I'm a Hebrew, and next thing you know is the Trinity is a Roman pagan concept that I can't abide by. And they get more into, we got to keep the law.
It becomes a hermeneutic. It becomes a filter for everything else.
Yeah, it's a as Daniel Dennett says about evolution being a toxin or a toxic poison that affects it's acid that corrodes everything, is his language. Hebrew Israelism is like that with the person's belief structure as well. It could start off kind of innocent, I think I'm a Hebrew, and ends up denial of deity of Jesus and salvation by grace through faith alone. The next thing, though, on that, I mentioned the syncretism. The next thing we've touched on, I believe, a little bit, is the 12 tribes of Israel have been identified according to Scripture. So one Westers go to Genesis 49, look at characteristics of the tribes, and then match those up with stereotypical traits of modern day peoples to associate them together. I'll just give you one example.
Okay.
Genesis 49 speaks about Issachar, and it says, he saw the land was good and enjoyed a rest. Different translations will say it different, but the point is Issachar enjoying a rest. Okay? They say, if you go to Mexico, they take siestas after lunch. It's like a nap, a time of relaxing in the middle of the day. Mm-hmm. And they say the siesta is a partial evidence that Issachar are actually modern day Mexicans.
Boy, I used to think that nothing could trump the ancient alien hypothesis for non sequitur logic, but you're pushing the boundary.
Yeah, so the rest referred to in Genesis 49 is evidence of siestas being in the Bible. Let me show you just one version. He saw that his resting place was good and that the land was pleasant. So he leaned his shoulder to bear a load and became a forced laborer. You can imagine what they do with that.
Right, sure.
Right, so they use that. Issachar is a strong donkey lying down between the saddlebags. So yeah, that's one that they use. With Benjamin, who they say they say Benjamites are like Jamaicans. Benjamin is a wolf. He tears his prey. In the morning he devours the prey. In the evening he divides the plunder. The key is Benjamin is a wolf. What do wolves do? They howl. They actually associate the howling of the wolf with reggae music. And they'll say how the Benjamites do what's called, it's a phrase they use, chanting down Babylon, which means to sing against the oppressive power. And they actually use the wolf language.
This is like, I hate to put it this way, but this is like totally detached from
the text itself, right?
Well, not only from the text, but in many cases, just reality. This is almost like, okay, flat earthers are still, like the craziest to me. Okay, so we're not in that territory, but what I'm hearing is these are like textbook examples of non sequitur thinking.
Yeah.
The confusing striking a correlation between two things that may or may not be coherent at all, but then leaping to causation. So you confuse correlation and causation. There's word fallacies with the sounds of words going on here.
The Anglo Israelites did that a lot, and they do that too. Denmark is Dan's mark.
Right. It's really detached from anything that you would call either scientific or reasoned data.
Well, let's say I was a Hebrew Israelite right now, and I just heard you say that. Well, that's just your white supremacy education coming through, where you think you get to define things. And if your Eurocentric understanding is all it is.
I actually wasn't taught that in school. See, I know that the human mouth can only make a certain number of sounds because we have a tongue and a palate and teeth and lips and things like that. And so linguists, okay, you pick Western, Eastern, I don't care, pick a linguist on Mars, okay? They're going to know that the human person, the human mouth, can only make a certain number of sounds. Therefore, it's normal for sounds to be present in all languages. But when I say, chin in Chinese, I'm not talking about this thing here. Okay, I'm using the same set of sounds, but it has no correlation to what the language is doing at all. And languages are bigger than words. They involve grammar. Okay, that has nothing to do with sounds. That's really the way, word formation, and even written language, there are rules for that. So again, I don't have to be, I wasn't taught linguistics in school. It's just something that you pick up when I get to graduate school, you're exposed to it, because my field was Semitic languages. And that was my first exposure to this kind of thing.
They would probably say, especially more in relation to your misunderstanding of history and all that stuff.
Right. But see, I can count up to 30 or 40. So I can count the number of sounds that a human mouth can make. I don't need an education to do that. And I can reason very simply and say, okay, if we have a limited number of sounds, and you have people using their mouths and breathing and nasalization and all this all over the world, because humans have the same set of lungs.
Right.
They all have noses and mouths. I'm going to make a finite number of sounds, and so it makes really good sense that all of the languages on Earth have the same sounds. It's just how they're assembled that's different. So again, that's just common sense. That's a grasp on reality. of the human mouth and the tongue and the nose and all that. It's all the things that we all share. Okay, so I don't need any of that. But again, that's a rabbit trail. But what I'm saying is, it just seems like I'm a little startled that nobody's thought about simple things like that. That in other words, to question the presumption that goes into some of this.
Well, the goal of having an identity that you feel is noble.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
Is such a worthy pursuit that when a person feels like they have found the place wherein to do that, belief system that allows them to do that, to have an identity that's
actually much more coherent
and dignified.
Just because that comes from the gut, the heart. I mean,
the argumentation almost is an afterthought.
Yeah,
it's almost.
Well, it would have to be because it's ridiculous, But the core issue that makes a lot of sense. Ancient Aliens, that crowd does the same thing, in that they reject Judeo-Christian accounts of creation, how we got here. And they also reject the mechanistic Darwinistic worldview. So the ancient alien hypothesis is just a middle ground for them. It's a meaningful worldview.
Yeah, I've seen the same thing with flat earthers. There's flat earther I talk to, and all the social media all begins with flat earth. Flat earth this, flat earth that.
Any other doctrinal points before we wrap up?
Well, since you mentioned the language, I think it's important when we talk about One West Hebrew Israelism to explain that they deny modern day Hebrew as being valid, real Hebrew.
Okay.
They actually call it Yiddish. Now I know Yiddish is two different things,
right.
But that's what they call it a lot of times. Right. And so they have something they call Lashawn Kadash, which is supposed to be like pure tongue.
Right, the holy language or something.
And it's based upon the idea that basically every letter only makes one sound. And what they've done is they take out all the vowel vocalizations and make their own speculative vocalizations, supposedly based upon Paleo-Hebrew. And a lot of it just becomes the A sound. So a lot of times when you hear them speak, you're like...
Paleo-Hebrew had no vowels, but let's...
So they offer their own speculative vocalizations, which came by way of an angelic vision.
Oh, okay. Well, the angelic vision trumps everything.
So, according to one account, Ariah had an angel who visited him in his apartment and was speaking a language, and Ariah did not understand it. He said, "What's that?" He said, "That's the language of your forefathers." Okay. And that was sort of the beginning for him to create Lashawn Kadash, which they teach primers of Lashawn Kadash. You can find the charts online, and you'll see everything is just the ah sound. So, Kwam Yasharallah means rise Israel, for example.
If you know a little bit of Hebrew, you can pick out the
So a lot of times, if I have friends, because sometimes I'll run into these names because they rename themselves, like Tazadakia and Tazariak and Yahana, Tahar. Sure. They rename themselves. Gabar. I'll say, what is this? And most of the time, my friends who are more well versed in Hebrew can usually pick out. But sometimes people are like, I don't know where they're getting this one from. Sometimes it's a little tricky to find out exactly what they were trying to go for.
Let's go back to again. This will be our last point here. I had in my notes here kind of an obvious one. What about Jesus and salvation? Just quickly, what do they think there? So
they'll say, you mean the man who the world ignorantly calls Jesus Christ, Yahweh Shai. He came to do away with the need for blood sacrifice. This is the common view. Okay. They sometimes have somewhat different views, but a most common view, for example, you can hear IUIC advocate this view, come to do away with blood sacrifice, so we don't anymore have to slaughter animals. And sometimes they'll say made some changes to the law. For example, we don't have to stone adulterers right now. But
salvation is still law-based?
So a lot of them are more sensitive to that criticism than they used to be. So they'll say, no, we affirm grace, but it's very Mormon-ish, and it's God is gracious in that he allows you to earn your salvation, or this is the means he's provided to do it. Or you could at least say it's a salvific alchemy, blending of grace and works.
But there's still, you would say there's still a strong element of merit.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Like you gotta do these commandments. You gotta do the law. You have to wear your fringes.
Okay.
There's a verse in the Bible that says the law is spiritual, and so sometimes they'll say, "You're not being spiritual right now, brother. Why not? You don't have your fringes on. The law is spiritual. You gotta wear your fringes."
Mm-hmm.
And so, if you want to know a way to identify a Hebrew Israelite, for example, who's serious about it, not out on the street situation, they'll have sometimes fringes underneath their T-shirt.
Okay.
And that's one way you can know. You see the fringes. So
Right.
the law is very, very important for salvation for them. Yes.
Okay. Well, we're going to be hitting some more of this, because I'm going to want to know, okay, these are the things they believe, but when we meet again, we're going to want to know, well, how are these things defended, using Scripture? Hopefully, well, I shouldn't say hopefully, but they have to attach this somehow.
Right.
Okay, to Scripture. So we'll hit that next time.
We'll get to the big one.
Yeah.
The big one.
Okay. Because we talked about the history of the Black Hebrew Israelite movement, and then last time we talked about, what are the sort of the core ideas, the core doctrines, and this time we want to get into the question of how do they defend this stuff? I mean, all that stuff we just talked about. How do they articulate this from Scripture, and just if you were having a conversation or debate with one, what are they going to do? How do they defend what they believe?
I'll give you 5 classes
Okay.
of defense that they offer.
Categories. Okay.
Yeah. And I'll start with maybe smallest to greatest. So one way, and so this is the least way, but it can't be discounted that it's part of what they use,
Okay.
are angelic visitations or visions.
Mm-hmm.
So the 12 tribes of Israel
pretty
chart.
common with fringe movements. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
the 12 tribes of Israel chart and the Lashawn Kadash language are both supposed to be revealed to, most sources say, to Ariah, who was in charge of the One West School for a long time.
Okay.
Crowdy, of course, in 1892 had a vision. But one we haven't really talked about that not all the camps accept. This is one particular camp that would accept this. They're called the Israelite Church of God in Jesus Christ, but they're significant because it's where Ariah is still today. He's still alive.
Okay.
This camp, though, was the original school. They just changed their name. So the original school is now called the ICGJC.
Mm-hmm.
Ariah is there sort of as a figurehead. He's an older man, but the man in charge, he says, his name is Tazadakia, real name Jermaine Grant, says that on this trip to Israel that the school took, near the Mount Olive area, he had a vision that informed him that he was the, quote, God-sent comforter manifested physically. And so the sounds bizarre, obviously, someone saying they're essentially the physical manifestation of the Holy Spirit.
Sure.
But it makes sense within One Westism because they teach reincarnation, and part of what they try to do during the school's heyday was to determine which one of their leaders were which figures of
Kind of
old.
like Dalai Lama kind of stuff, which one's the next one.
Ariah was John the Revelator. A man named Mashah was King David and Moses. Tahar was rumored to be Paul. And so, they kind of took up a lot of the best characters. Well, later on, Tazadakia says, no one's got the Holy Spirit, though.
Right, yeah.
And so his critics call him comfy, but the members in the school don't call that. They'll say the God-sent comforter. But that's who he claimed to be. So only one camp accepts that, but that shows you the importance of vision. And one more, when the school, which again, everyone must remember, this is the main school, just under a different name. That's why it gets confusing. Was doing these different doctrinal changes, such as Jermaine Grant is actually the God-sent comforter. Ariah says that before his father, who was also involved with the Commandment Keepers in the beginning of the One West School, his name is Yaquab, real name Peter Sherrod. Ariah says before his father died, he received a visit from an angel, and the angel told him that a lot of the doctrine of the original school was wrong. So this was used as a way to justify some of the changes that were going on. But it's sort of retconning to the nerds in the audience who know that term. It was total retcon because Yaquab was already dead. So Ariah is saying this angelic visitation happened at this time. And so you see how it happens. Now, not all the leaders resort to this, okay? But it's significant within the school of One West that enough of it has happened.
So that's sort of the... We can't say least important, but that's on the low end of the defense.
It's the least frequent. Okay. I'll say that. Right. I've run into one particular Hebrew Israelite who does say that an angel appeared to him in the sky, and he had an afro, and all he did was smile at him. And the man says that he took that as confirmation to let him know he was an Israelite. The angel was smiling at him.
Right.
But this was just one personal guy I knew.
So how else do they defend their system?
Internal subjectivism. So related to the person, basically a sense or a feeling.
This is the identity thing that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, it's almost like someone will say, the day I discovered or heard I was an Israelite, I always knew.
So it's kind of like the Mormon burning in the bosom sort of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
And sometimes they use the word actually vibration. They'll say, I could tell by the vibration. And sometimes they do this also to determine who was not an Israelite, this internal subjectivism. They'll say, that man's vibration is all wrong. There's no way he's a Jake. Now, a Jake means an Israelite who's not awakened yet to their status as an Israelite. Because before Israel was named Israel, he was named Jacob.
Yeah.
So Jake is sort of their religious slang for that. So they justify this for the test the spirits verse of 1 Thessalonians, and also the spirit being subject to the spirit of the prophets in 1 Corinthians. That's how they use that. But they might say something like, you could tell by his vibration he's a Hamite. And that's significant because on their theology, Hamites look like them but aren't them. They're another people. So they believe Africans who are Hamites will be in bondage to them in the kingdom.
It's a very convenient way to distance yourself or embrace, depending on what direction you want to go.
Yeah, so that internal subjectivism is a key thing. And they even do this to their opponents. So they might say the reason these two Edomites are sitting on this couch is because they know their time is short. And Esau is trying to fight against this, but they know they're Edomites. So they actually use the internal subjectivism even projecting on others.
Right. It's just not, they're internally subjectivizing someone else's internal subjectivism.
Yeah.
Okay, and that makes perfect sense.
You're getting it. You're getting it.
All right, so what else?
Perceived authorities. So if you're in a camp, these men are prophets. They call them elder and apostles.
Sure.
GMS always opens up every video saying double honors to the elders and apostles of Great Millstone. So the perceived authorities within the camp, but also some transcend camps, meaning people who are considered important, or works that are considered important by all people.
How do they get that status? Is that also visionary, or is that attributed to them by the community?
Well, every now and then you'll see someone who picks up a little bit of real Hebrew knowledge, and they can teach basic Hebrew grammar, and they like to do. Sometimes they start doing gematria.
Is this real Hebrew or their version of Hebrew, or both?
It's weird. What happens? What I've seen is when one Westers learn real Hebrew, which is kind of rare, which is really, really rare. They're discouraged to do it. They kind of become ambivalent about Lashawn Kadash, and so they have a weird relationship with their own roots. But non-One West Hebrew Israelites who aren't attached to Lashawn Kadash, sometimes they do learn Hebrew. Okay. And when they do that, they like to do gematria. So sometimes they become authorities because of some of their Hebrew knowledge.
For the sake of our viewers, gematria is just quick
assigning. You're probably better at it than I am.
Well, it's
assigning numbers to the characters and getting hidden meanings out of it.
Yeah, numerical value to letters and doing the math.
Yeah. So sometimes there's a guy who I respect. So he'll probably watch this. This is not shade to him. Like I don't agree with some of his practice, how he gets there, but I respect him as a man, and I respect a lot of what he does. His name is Zion Lex, and I've had friendly conversation with him. He knows a lot of information. Like he's if you wanted to watch an able apologist for Hebrew Israelism, some of the things I'm talking about, even though they're more common on the street, they're not necessarily the best Hebrew Israelism has to offer. Someone like Zion Lex would be someone who would be more formidable. You watch, it's like, oh, he's making some good points there, and again, doesn't mean his religion's right. But
means he's a little more attached to data that are real.
He is, and so again, I mean, I'll give Zion Lex. I don't mind giving Zion Lex a shout out. Like if you watch him, you say, okay, because sometimes if you see a guy like that, a lot of what I'm saying won't seem to apply because you're like, well, this is not what Vocab was talking about. I'm talking about the common man on the street. Hebrew is like the guy at your job,
the guy you're going to run into the street.
Yeah, like that. But you do sometimes see that. So they become authorities when they do that. But books as well, not just people living right now. Even though this author is still alive, Rudolph Windsor. This is sort of the book of the book because what it does is offers them an entirely different alternative history that props up their understanding of how they got where they got, and different things like that. But the book itself is not well sourced at all. I'll show you a leap in logic first. Okay. And if this is too much, cut it out or something like that.
It's not that we've not seen any of those already.
Right. So they're talking about ancient black civilization, chapter 1 in this book. It's called From Babylon to Timbuktu, by the way, by Rudolph Windsor. This area was also the location of the Garden of Eden, and the people of this region were jet black. So he's talking about the original folks being black.
Yeah.
And it's such a weird thing to use the jet black.
Jet black, yeah.
Turn the page. Because the Garden of Eden is associated with the land of Ethiopia, we can conclude that the people were black. So let me read that again. Because the Garden of Eden is associated with the land of Ethiopia, we can conclude that the people were black. So there's numerous problems in just that tiny little sentence. Well, the whole book is like that. Like I've got all the little places of the list.
I'm still stuck on how you get Eden associated with Ethiopia.
But so they do it. I think he does it with the rivers. Page 23. Because the colored people of the world are in a majority, it is proper to infer that the whites have always been a minority and that the black people are the original people of humanity. So the main problem, I think, there's the last sentence, that the idea that the black people are the original people of humanity, and it's weird how he gets there. I'm going to read one more from page 25.
Sure.
Therefore, the leprosy that Naaman had will cleave unto you and unto your seed descendants forever. And he departed from his presence a leper as white as snow. This type of leprosy affected the reproductive organs, genes, and chromosomes that determine hereditary characteristics in his body. And I'll show you who's talking about here in a second. This meant all his children would produce white offspring, even though he was a black man at first. This was the curse of Gehazi. I always mispronounce it. Gehazi. Yeah. So basically, lepers equals whites. They're accounting for the origin of white people.
Right.
So that's how he does it. Now, not all Hebrew Israelites do that, but that is a really common move.
Sure, yeah.
But I mean, just that sentence is incredibly tortured.
Well, yeah, that's being kind.
The whole book is like that. Okay. And it doesn't source. There's a place where he literally says, the Bible Dictionary says. It actually says, the Bible Dictionary.
Okay.
What? Smith's, Easton's, Cambridge? So the Bible
Dictionary? There's only 50 or 60 of those.
So that's the way the book is sourced. But they'll read it publicly, they'll hold it up, and they just give Windsor a pass.
Yeah, I won't even ask if they get into like peer-reviewed journal literature, because that seems kind of obvious.
No, but there's a guy who's claiming he's going to do that. So I'll name drop him too. He'll take this segment and put it. Divine Prospect, I don't really like calling him that. It's a little strange. But Ron Shields, but I know he calls himself Divine Prospect. I don't mean as disrespect to want to call him Ron Shields.
Yeah,
anyways,
I'm betting I know what journals he's going to pick already, because there are
really?
There are a couple that were created just to reinforce like the Afrocentric view.
Really?
Yes. There are a couple of journals that exist only to perpetuate that idea.
Wow.
And in other words, they have the veneer of scholarship and peer review, but basically the only people that review the articles are people who already, adopt that idea.
Well, I didn't know that exactly.
Well,
I want to hear more about this.
Right, when it comes out, just shoot it to me, and I'll let you know. I'll let you know if my intuition is correct.
Stuff like that is why what we in the field, like my friend Adam Coleman uses the term a lot. I don't know who invented it, but pseudo-scholarship.
Yeah.
It has the appearance or veneer in some way. But honestly, when you read this, I don't even think it has.
This doesn't even rise to that level.
They would, to them it does. But now again, we got to keep in mind, any movement grows over time, and we've seen them become more sophisticated and nuanced.
Yeah,
so if I do this interview 5 years from now, some of it, they might be more sophisticated by then.
So what are I think we covered 3.
2 more left.
2 more.
Second category, or we're going 5 from to 1, are what they call the color passages.
Okay.
These are scriptures that they believe describe Israelites as black peoples.
All right.
And so the big one is with Jesus, whom most of them, when we're talking about one Westerners, call Yahweh, Revelation 1:14 through 15. Revelation 1:14 through 15. And they zoom in on the idea of where it says that Jesus' hair was white like wool. They kind of morph that into
the Ancient of Days imagery from Daniel 7.
Yeah, they'll go back to Daniel 7 and they use that with Revelation, and basically they say Jesus had woolly hair. What people on earth have woolly hair? The so-called black man. And they'll say his feet were burned like bronze or brass. They'll say, what color is something when it gets burnt? I'll say black. So if his feet are black, what color is the rest of his body?
Right, even though it doesn't say black.
It doesn't.
Right.
The passage is describing the majesty and glory and even indeed deity of heavenly Jesus, not the ethnicity of earthly Jesus.
Right.
The whole passage is basically a glowing man. If you read it from start to finish,
and
his feet are glowing is what's happening.
And that's stock description of supernatural beings, just across the board in antiquity.
But they do a thing where they say, well, if something's burnt, it's black.
Right. Even though Hebrew has a word for black that isn't the word for burnished bronze. Okay.
Well, there in the Greek, Greek with the Revelation passage, the sense of the word is like that they're. My understanding of the sense is not that they have been burned. It's like some completed process. It's like they're in the process of burning, along those lines. But
Right.
but
I'm just thinking of Daniel, not the Revelation stuff.
the Daniel 7:9.
I'm thinking of the source text. But what's the other?
Jeremiah 14:2 we looked at before the show is another one. Although one camp, Sakari, is getting away from that because they're even realizing how
This is
bad
the one
it
where
is.
it kind of depends on the translation too, if I recall.
King James uses an old understanding of the word black. I got it right here, actually. So if you look, there's a dictionary from 1755, Samuel Johnson and John Walker,
Okay.
Dictionary of the English Language. And what it says is here that the word black, this is under the entry for black, can mean of the color of night, dark, cloudy of countenance, sullen, horrible, wicked, dismal, mournful.
Right. And so what does Jeremiah 14:2 say?
Black unto the ground is what it says, but
Yeah,
they're using
black
it.
unto the ground.
Yeah, they're using it in the sense of mourning into the ground. And if you look at most translations now, they'll say something like that. They say
Like they're bowed in mourning.
yeah, it's not the color of Judah's skin.
They're bowing in grief, toward the ground. Okay.
In the Hebrew,
And the King James uses the word black there because of this dictionary.
right,
Okay.
it's a verb, not an adjective. The actual Hebrew, I don't know if the word there, I don't, but that's the word that's in the text.
Kadru
Yeah.
is what I'm looking at.
It's a
there.
verb.
Yeah.
It's not an adjective.
That's interesting.
So the black into the ground, it fails at the
It describes an activity, not a quality, is
Right.
what you're getting at. Yeah.
So one of the camps, Sakari, who is, I think you can describe them safely as a radical One West camp. They do the whole boot kissing thing. We haven't even talked about that, but that's where they have people bow down to them and kiss their shoes in compliance with passages that, or what sometimes scholars call the submission motif of, lick the dust and all that.
Right.
Sakari engages that heavily, and yet they're even getting away from this argument. They're no longer employing it. So some of the One West camps are realizing this is not a great argument after all, but
Right.
we'll
So
see.
what's the remaining category?
So here's the big one. Prophetic characteristic passages. I don't know what to call them. Maybe you can help me come up with a different name. But they're passages that they would say describe the character or traits, not physically, something else about them, of the true Jews, of Israelites.
Okay.
Conditions they might be in. And the big one I mentioned at the end of the last show is Deuteronomy 28. That is what we call the locus classicus of Hebrew Israelism.
All right, so
Deuteronomy 28.
Do you have any part of that to quote?
Well, the big verse out of Deuteronomy 28 is verse 68.
Okay.
And of course, you more than well know this, it's essentially stock for a treaty, the covenant treaties.
Sure. Yeah.
And so
Blessings and cursings and witnesses and all that stuff.
they're not even using the passage in the right way. They're looking at it as like it's some kind of prophetic thing of here's what's going to happen. But it's more just like, if you don't do this, here's what will happen. They use it in a strange way. I don't think they're justified in their use of it.
Okay.
Verse 68 says this, though. The Lord will take you back in ships to Egypt by a route that I said you would never see again. There you will sell yourselves to your enemies as male and female slaves, but no one will buy you. Now I'm using the Christian Standard Bible. I usually use the ESV, but this fit in my bag better.
Okay.
They use the KJV because one part it says, not that you will sell yourselves, but you will be sold. But let me show you how they use this passage, Dr. Heiser.
Right.
The Lord will take you back in ships to Egypt. They'll say those are slave ships. So the ships are literal. And a lot of times they'll just act like the passage says slave ships.
And so God is basically saying, hey, I delivered you from Egypt, but if you violate the terms of the covenant, I'm going to put you on ships and take you right back.
But they say Egypt means house of bondage, not literal Egypt. Now, as a response, I sometimes show them verse 60. And I also show them verse 27. The Lord will afflict you with the boils of Egypt. Verse 60. He will afflict you again with all the diseases of Egypt, meaning the other two times you have
plagues,
Egypt there.
yeah.
It's actually the space of land
Right.
that happened in Egypt.
And in Hebrew, it'd be the same word anyway.
But here, it means house of bondage. What it means is the Lord's going to take you back in slave ships into slavery. So the ships are literal, but the Egypt is metaphorical or symbolic.
Okay. So they're splitting the verse into metaphorical and literal parts.
I call it Hebrew hopscotch.
Okay.
So then by a route I said you would never see again. So the idea of going back, you can't go back to a place you've never been. Israelites can't go back to the Western Hemisphere or back to the United States or back to Brazil. because they've never been there.
Right.
It makes sense if you're saying back to Egypt because they had been there.
Right.
They're saying what just means back into slavery. They fall back on that.
So that the metaphorical part there is really important to them.
Yes. There you will sell yourselves to your enemies as male and female slaves. No one will buy you. You're destitute, indentured servant, don't have anything to offer, get out of debt, offer yourself. It's going to be so bad, though, no one will even want to buy your services. That makes sense. They say you'll be sold, so they use the KJV there.
Sure.
And then the key, though, is what they do with this. No one will buy you. They say, buy can be redeem. And what it means is no one will save us out of our condition.
Okay.
So not buy. Even though you have sell, it makes sense that you have buy. They say it's sell and redeem.
Right.
And redeem is to save you from your condition.
Right. So now they're basically just altering the vocabulary there.
Yeah, so 68 is important, but it's not the only verse that's important. They'll go through all this, and they'll say, who owns the stores in our neighborhoods and stuff. And I mean, if there's anything to credit some version of even one West Hebrew Israelism is, when you talk about having an entrepreneurial spirit, some of the camps are getting into that. These are things that I would say are good things. Now, it's just you don't have to use bad doctrine to get there.
Right.
But, there's some good points, borrowing, and instead it's better to be the lender, not the borrower. You go through these things in health, because this is all related to the verse. But there's questions to ask them, and I don't know, we might do that more when we critique them.
We'll have you back and we can critique, sort of evaluate, what's going on here. But yeah, that was good. But this last one is sort of the most fundamental kind of, maybe it is a fundamental.
It's their John 3:16.
Okay.
It's their John 3:16.
All right, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah.
Then. All right. Well, thanks for being with us again.
I'm glad to be here, Dr. Heiser.
We've had you here for 3 interviews. And we've talked a lot about what this movement believes, and now we want to get into some evaluation or analysis, some critique of their ideas. So you mentioned last time that Deuteronomy 28, verse 68 is a big deal. Mm-hmm. So why don't we start there? You said that was sort of the main core of where a lot of this goes.
That's the big daddy. Well, let's illustrate.
Before we do that, remind the audience of what that idea was. What does that verse say?
The verse, they think, gives evidence that folks who came to the Western Hemisphere via the transatlantic slave trade are the true descendants of the biblical Israelites.
Okay. All right. So that verse becomes justification. So what do you have here?
I have a children's book. Now, we've been talking about one-Westers today, primarily. I want to make sure everyone knows this is not written by a one-Wester. Huldah is not a one-Wester. Huldah Dawood. She does some of the gematria we mentioned earlier. I always mispronounce that. Gematria? Gematria. It's a harder G. Gematria. I always do that. But Little Judah in America. And it's interesting because they don't like J when it comes to Jesus and other stuff, but when it comes to Judah, they don't.
Oh, yeah, that's right, because what's their name for Jesus?
Well, hers is different than the one-Westers, but one-Westers is Yahweh-Shai. Okay. But then they still say Judah.
Right. Okay.
So
that is a little odd, yeah.
There's a lot of these memes float around that say, the letter J didn't exist until such and such, so Jesus couldn't be his name. But they're okay when it comes to Judah. Anyways, so this is Little Judah in America, and I want to illustrate the point about Deuteronomy 28 by having...
Story time
with Uncle Vocab. And I'm turning here to a page. I'm going to read this, and it illustrates what I'm talking about. In 70 AD, the Romans sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. Yah warned my ancestors about these bad things at Deuteronomy 28, 15 through 68. But they did not listen. My people were forced to migrate into various parts of Africa. Finally, they were put on slave ships and scattered all over the earth, just like Deuteronomy 28, 68 foretold. And there's one of the drawings of the horrible conditions slaves were in. And then this is a big page to read right here to show it. And Yahuwah, so that's her name for Yahweh. And Yahuwah shall bring you into Egypt, and notice it has in parentheses bondage. Okay. So there's some of the...
there's that metaphorical understanding of Egypt. Yeah.
Again with ships, by the way of which I spake unto you, you shall see it no more again. And there you shall be sold into your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. And so they think that's fulfilled in the transatlantic slave trade. And I'll just read one last thing. For many years, my family who came to America on these ships were forced to work for free in terrible conditions for a cruel people. And that's sad and true and unjust, but it doesn't mean, of course, that we're talking about Israelites, yeah. During this time, many of my family forgot their history and how important they were to Yah. They continued to break Yah's laws, and he left them here even after the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863. So we are still in the land of our captivity. So
that illustrates the whole Deuteronomy 28:68 thinking. Yeah.
So I thought that was important to read, and also show that they're getting into children's literature as well. Then again, that's a non-One Wester. So she's female, has a prominent teaching role. Most One West camps wouldn't even allow her to do that.
Okay.
But she has a thing going on the internet that's pretty well known.
So when you get into a discussion about that verse, how do you critique it? How do you address it?
Well, sometimes I like to just tell them the background of Deuteronomy 28. I briefly mentioned it in a prior show, but
it's a covenant. Yeah.
Between a lesser power, or basically someone under subjugation of some kind, and a king or a ruler, and it's saying here's what I want you to do, and here's what will happen if you don't. Here's what will happen.
Series of blessings or a series of cursings. Yeah.
The curses are longer, just like in Deuteronomy 28, and I'll just kind of speak about what is your justification for using Deuteronomy 28 in the way in which you're using it in. And honestly, usually it seems like they don't really understand the question, because what I'm trying to ask in essence is, how do you justify utilizing Deuteronomy 28 as a scriptural DNA test? Because that's kind of what they're using it for. Not literally DNA, because a lot of them discount that. Some don't, but most do. But they're kind of saying, here's how we know who the Israelites are, because they meet these conditions. And what I'm saying is, how was that what Deuteronomy 28 was ever supposed to be used for?
Right. How is that a good method to approach it? Yeah.
Exactly. So starting with the presupposition, like there's nowhere in the Bible, Mike, that says use Deuteronomy 28 to recall your identity or anything like that. It doesn't have to be woodenly that, but it doesn't give you a hint. Like, for example, people have realized certain passages in the Tanakh were messianic, and they would point those, and some they knew, some they didn't. Later, Jesus would say this one is messianic as well. But there's a lot, they kind of knew certain passages and different things. It's just, what's the justification? They like to say line upon line, precept upon precept. So sometimes I'll say, what's your precept for using Deuteronomy 28 in this way? I never heard a good answer for why it's the justification. They just say, we meet the character of the people described in this book. So that's the first thing, is to challenge the presupposition. The whole enterprise needs to be challenged, I think, because there is no justification for it, because that's not what the passage is intended for.
It's really odd. I mean, I know that the Jews today, who the black Israelites say are not really Jews.
Imposters, yeah.
Right, they're imposters, but something like the Exodus is still fundamental to their identity. So I'm wondering how those people, the imposters, could remember this thousands of years later, but somehow, until the late 1800s, you don't have the African-American community, the slave community in the South in the days, the Civil War, post-Civil War. That seems to be when, again, somebody, quote unquote, remembers this. I mean, what about all this long stretch of history, from antiquity till now? It seems like nobody was talking about this. I don't know how the imposters, it becomes part of their identity and nobody forgets it because it's just core.
Right.
And then the ones that are supposed to be the true Israelites, nobody remembers it at all until the 19th century.
I've asked similar questions, and so a few things happen. One is they point back to a book we went through earlier, which is From Babylon to Timbuktu, which gives them an alternative history, a revisionist history, that basically tries to show you all these places where this idea did pop up or was evident or was relevant.
Somebody was remembering it somewhere.
Yeah, or they'll say, here's evidence to it. They would. Some folks would challenge what you just said. Oh, that's not how it worked anyway. Yah's always had a remnant or a testimony to his people or something like that, someone might say. Another thing people do, they'll say is, well, you don't understand as a non-sympathetic, non-person of color. This is sometimes the way people approach it. How bad slavery was and how our identity and culture and language was ripped away so very thoroughly. And so a lot of the explanation lies in sort of what happened at the transatlantic slave trade, which is true, but it doesn't equal it was ripped away from a Hebraic identity, of course. It doesn't equal that. But usually it's one of those. But really, Hebrew Israelism, I view it as a restorationist movement. They're saying here was the original gospel with the original people of the book, and that's been lost this whole time, and now we need to be restored to what that was. Just like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses, it's lost, and here it is again. I view Hebrew Israelism in that vein, to an extent, in my opinion, as a restorationist movement of sorts. So there's that. So that's the first thing. Another thing I'll do is I'll say, okay, before we read these curses, what do you think is one of the worst things that befell Israelites? Isn't it that they would lose their very identity of who they were? And usually they agree to some statement like that. That seems like the worst thing. And I'll say, okay, in this list of curses we're about to look at, can you show me where that curse is listed?
Oh, so the curse of losing your identity is not present in the curses.
Never even promised anywhere in Scripture. Nothing like that is ever shown in Scripture. So if we're going to look at this list of curses, can you show me where that curse specifically was mentioned? And it's not in there. So sometimes, though, what they do is go to Jeremiah 17:4. And in the CSB it says, you will on your own relinquish your inheritance. Again, they'd like the KJV rendering better, but they look at it as, hey, you're going to lose your inheritance. In Jeremiah 17:4, it's promised our identity to be stripped away. Now, the inheritance really has to do with the land and the related promises. And you can see that in other passages. And there in Jeremiah 17:4, you can even see it if you read through the whole passage, that it's not, because it even says right after it, that I gave you. It literally says it right after it. I will make you serve your enemies in a land you do not know. So they're losing.
There's the land element, yeah.
And another thing about a lot of these promises of destruction have to do with Israel being removed from her land. Deuteronomy 28, the transatlantic slave trade equivalency thesis, if you want to call it something like that, meaning it requires Israelites being ripped out of their land. Well, the transatlantic slave trade, they're being ripped out of West Africa. They're not even being taken away from the land.
Right, they're not being taken away from Israel again.
Right. So I try to challenge some of the very presuppositions, but it's very difficult because they go to Jeremiah 17:4, they do this other stuff, and then start looking at some of the text. So we could turn there, and I'll show you some questions that are really good to think about. And look, if Hebrew Israelite is watching this, I hope they would think about this and say, is my understanding of this passage is it really right? Because a lot is resting on this. And so I'll show you a few of the questions that I would want to ask. One we kind of already got to in verse 68, when we'll return to that, but let me show you a few others. Verse 36, the Lord will bring you and your king, that you have appointed, to a nation neither you nor your fathers have known, and there you will worship other gods of wood and stone. So you and your king. So that's fulfilled in the pages of Scripture itself.
History of Israel.
Yeah, it's right there. You don't need to. I'll tell them sometimes, you don't need a leapfrog to the transatlantic slave trade. It's right in the pages of the Bible. Because it's interesting. A lot of their thesis depends on proving it outside of Scripture. It's an extra biblical information supposedly to prove the Deuteronomy.
It's really odd because just without even looking at what happens later in the biblical story. When you have the kings, you have the monarchy, you got Saul, David, Solomon, and it splits into two, and eventually they're all carried off into exile with their kings.
Right.
Okay. But where would they say? I mean, who were the kings among them in the slave trade? I mean, how does that work? And
that's exactly what I asked.
When they came over here, they didn't. As far as I know, the slave community wasn't given to idolatry. It's not like they're building idols over here. And I mean, how do they handle that?
Well, let's return to the king thing in a second, but it's funny what you just said, where it says there you worship other gods of wood and stone. Believe it or not. They say the God of wood is Christians worshiping the cross, and the God of stone is Muslims worshiping the Kaaba stone in Mecca, and that's our people.
Right, but how does that happen in America, like the latter one with the Kaaba?
Well, they would just say because they're Muslims, so that's ultimately the stone god they worship, even if they're in America. They would say our people join Christianity to Islam, and that's proof. They actually view this verse as proof.
But they wouldn't lump themselves into that, would they?
No, those are people who are asleep to their identity.
Okay. Well, so when the black Israelites come over, when they're driven, we'll get back to their king with whoever this king was supposed to be, and they wind up in North America,
or Jamaica, or
any of that. So, is the reference to idolatry what they're doing? Because that seems to be the way that Deuteronomy 28 reads. That
the people who have been taken captive in this new
they're
land.
The ones that they become idolaters.
Exactly. Adopt the foreign religion. Christianity, worshiping the cross.
Yeah.
And sometimes I hear this, they'll also say, what are churches made out of?
Okay, so they're all right.
Which is wood and stone. They'll do that as well. But mainly it's the Kaaba stone, because they'll say, look at all the black converts to Islam. So the question about the king, though, is pertinent. So I'll say, who is the king? Because people just got to stop and think. Africa is a continent. And even today, it's the most diverse geographical region really in the world as far as DNA goes. Great diversity among the continent. When you look at that, and then you look at on the west coast of Africa, if you want to sort of zero in on there, because that's where a lot of the transatlantic slave trade, that's where people were kidnapped from.
Sure.
It was kidnapping, which under Old Testament law, they would have been put to death for that. But so we look at that, there's different tribal groups, different linguistic groups, different ethnicities, just all this different stuff. And different folks are getting snatched up, and if, they heard two people speaking the same language, they would separate them right away, separate families, and try to put them with people who may have been their traditional enemies or people that come from regions they don't know. My point is that there couldn't even be one king over all these people anyway, because it's a diverse set of peoples. And so who would be the king over all of them? So I guess you could say there could be a king. Every now and then I'll get a Hebrew Israelite who say, well, here's this African king who was caught up in the transatlantic slave trade. I usually am not able to validate their sources. The closest I know to anything like that, and I don't think this really is fulfillment of it, is actually a young man named Samuel Morris. But see, he wasn't caught up in the slave trade. He had a different story about how he ended up in America, but he did end up in here and became actually a young missionary. But he was a prince. I'm sorry, I didn't explain it.
He
was a prince.
Blood, okay.
He was a prince, but he didn't come because of the transatlantic slave trade. He did come because of warring factions within his nation and linked up with missionaries and became a believer. But I'm just saying that's the only prince I know who even kind of prince royalty who came over here.
So as we wrap up this segment, they really don't have a good answer, it sounds to me.
I don't think so.
For the king element there.
I don't think so at all. And sometimes they'll say, well, you don't always have to have a king because the curses are perpetual, and not every curse happens at every punishment injunction. So kind of mildly sophisticated.
Right. So if that part doesn't work, it's okay. We don't have to.
Right. If I was a Hebrew Israelite apologist, that's what I would go with.
Right.
I know we're wrapping up, so let me just show you one. Let me just show you one more.
Sure.
Verse 52 of Deuteronomy 28. They will besiege you within all your city gates until your high and fortified walls that you trust in come down throughout your land. They will besiege you within all your city gates throughout the land the Lord your God has given you. Again, that's a reference earlier to the fact that it's from the land of Israel.
Right.
But secondly, I like to say these Europeans, these Portuguese, indeed these folks in the Middle East, the Muslims involved in the slave trade, what city gates did they stomp in, and what fortified walls did they besiege?
Right. How does that description conform to what actually happened?
It happened in the Bible, didn't it?
Yeah.
It happened in the Bible.
Yeah, certainly in biblical history.
Yeah, but it didn't happen during the transatlantic slave trade.
Yeah.
Not because there was, no kingdoms in Africa. No one's saying that. No one's saying there was no magnificent structures. There were. We're just saying, when did this happen in the transatlantic slave trade? Because that's not really helpful.
So what's the response?
I have not heard a good one of that. I think a lot of it, I would just resort to, well, it doesn't happen all the time. But then you get to, okay, what is being fulfilled in the transatlantic slave trade then? At a certain point.
Yeah, at some point, there's enough of it that isn't being fulfilled that you got to question the whole premise. Yeah,
and again, this is important. I know we started with the children's story. Let me share one other thing. There's a platinum artist, an incredible artist. I like Christian hip hop, so I don't really sweat the secular artist, but a talented guy, sometimes flirts with a kind of a light Christian spirituality named Kendrick Lamar. Talented guy, kind of like the thinking millennials rapper. And on his last album, it was called Damn, as in D-A-M-N, as in our people are damned. Right. That was the very thesis of the album. And this is this is platinum in a day when people don't sell records as much. And on there, he has his cousin named Carl Benai Israel, or I forgot his full name, but he used to be with IUIC. Anyways, he's leaving all these voice messages that are like teaching throughout the songs, and then sometimes the song content weaves into it. My point is, it's all Hebrew Israelism. The concept of the album title, and this is a platinum album that just came about. And here's what Carl said when he was interviewed on it. Here's why I'm saying all this. He was speaking, he was saying he was teaching Kendrick, and Kendrick's like people around him from the scriptures, how they're the people of the book. And Carl says that when he brought out Deuteronomy 28, everyone's minds were blown. He specifically said, when I brought out the Deuteronomy 28, their minds were blown. It's like that when they saw that, like, wait, what? And that's exactly the reaction you get when, the people, they kind of ambush people theologically on the street and show them this, and people are like, wow. But it's really, where's the beef?
Yeah. If you're someone who gets hit with that and you don't have any context for it, it looks like a point's being made when it really isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that with us, and I have other things I want to talk to you about, and we'll get to those in the next episode or so. But that's really interesting stuff. And again, a lot of it's new to me, and I'm sure a lot of it's new to our audience too. So thanks.
Yes, sir.
We are back again with Vocab Malone, and we are in a series of segments sort of evaluating the claims, the beliefs of the Black Hebrew Israelites. And last time we talked about Deuteronomy 28, sort of a core text for them. But earlier you mentioned a lot of things about, again, for lack of a better term, classifying races, with people groups in the Bible. So I want to unpack that a little bit more and hear what you think about the way they do that.
Sure.
Just critique that.
So again, we remember when we talk about one West Hebrew Israelites, they believe that every modern people group can be found in the pages of Scripture as an ancient people group and should be viewed that way. So they do that with two main ways. Go ahead.
Are they aware of how many people groups there really are in the modern world? Because like the United Bible Society, there
right.
How many thousand languages are there?
Yeah.
Are they aware
quite
of that?
a few. Well, they it's funny, even starting in Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, a lot of scholars say there's 70 nations represented there.
Right. It can actually be geographical, just areas.
Yeah, they've got only 18 groups of people that they categorize.
And if you just go by people groups, it's hundreds and hundreds.
Yeah.
But anyway, I don't want to take you on a rabbit trail there, but that just popped into my head because, do we really know how big this is?
Right. And so they think they've identified them when it comes to the one Westers, and they go about referring to people by those names. So, for example, there's a Christian apologist who interacted with him named James White. They call him James White the Edomite. And so
because it rhymes,
and so he's an Edomite. Now, if you think about it, though, the Edomite classification is helpful for this religion because Edomites were somebody who was supposed to be a help to Israel, being such close relatives, Jacob, Esau, but were often enemies instead, and were glad about their destruction, and indeed are the focus of some of the judgment oracles in the Bible, specifically, especially the book of Obadiah. And so it's helpful for polemics, for against folks. But let me show you some of the ways they do this association. So I have some notes here I'm going to actually need to read. Esau was red when he emerged from the womb. This is how they would describe it, okay? And hairy. And so they speak about the average white person being red and hairy. And red because they get out in the sun, they get burnt, they blush, you can see their face, or if you slap them, they turn red.
Right.
So red and hairy white people. And he was a good hunter, and I kid you not, they go into tirades about white people waiting in trees long times to hunt animals and stuff, and how that's like something they're skilled at because of their take on the characteristics of Esau.
I don't know that you could find anybody in West modern America who'd be very skilled at that, but go ahead.
Well, so that's that. It continues on in Genesis 27:40, which references to the sword as a blessing, and they use that to explain the military prowess of European powers, during the colonial era, and the modern United States. This association continues on with Obadiah 1:3, which states there that Edom's habitation is high. It says Edom's habitation is high. Now, you got Petra down there, and you got these guys living in rock cliffs and all that stuff, right? Any guesses, since you're kind of learning the trajectory of this, how do you think, if you just had to guess, what do you think they're going to say?
People who live in cities and tall buildings?
Skyscrapers.
See,
I'm getting it.
I am feeling really un-Edomite here because I'm afraid of heights, and I'm not going to hunt anything from trees, and I don't live in a city. Go ahead.
But if you go out in the sun, it'll prove.
Yeah, I'll get sunburned. All right.
So it's an allusion to tall buildings and skyscrapers, usually supposedly erected by white people. Obadiah 1:4 states that Edom will exalt itself like an eagle, and they point that to being a symbol, the eagle, for Rome, Nazi Germany, and the United States of America. And listen to this. This is true. It's hard to stomach some of this one West interpretation.
Sure.
The same verse refers to Edom setting its nest among the stars, They associate that with, any guesses?
Penthouses? I don't know.
The moon landing.
Oh, the moon landing.
And the nest with the and the nest with the space station.
Okay.
And because what did Neil Armstrong say? What has landed?
The eagle has landed.
He gave himself away.
Gave himself away.
Yeah. So this is some of the association. They do some further associations that I won't get into here right now. But here's what's interesting.
That's good because I can still think in a linear fashion after listening to this.
In some extra-biblical texts, there's a few places in rabbinic texts that associate Rome symbolically with Edom. Mm-hmm. And I've looked at some of these. I have a friend who's looked at even more of them. And it's sort of a symbolic way to make Rome sort of a new archenemy. It doesn't ever seem to indicate a literal physical descent. Right. But even if Rome somehow were the Edomites, which that's not what these extra-biblical rabbinic texts are saying, it still doesn't mean the United States and Europe and everyone else.
You know what the intermediary is there? It's Babylon. Edom gets associated with Babylon.
I didn't know that.
In the Old Testament. Really? Because Edom, the Edomites assisted in the conquest of Judah.
And laughed.
Right. And so since Rome and Babylon was a major association, it's not shocking that Rome would be associated with Edom as well, because those two are associated in the Old Testament. That's a coherent rabbit trail.
Yeah. No, that's helpful because so part of what we try to do.
I'm sorry to throw in some coherent rabbit trails with this.
That's good because what some of us, so like I have a friend named Abu who some of this I get from picking his brain, and he's the guy I called during the break. He was my I said I'm gonna phone a friend. Okay. He's just fantastic, and part of what we do when we talk is because it sounds. Sometimes I feel like we take some of the Hebrew Israelite beliefs more seriously than what they do, and we try to understand what are they really trying to say here, and where does this come from? Right. And so sometimes we'll try to see, and I mentioned earlier when I talked about the history of One West, a little bit their association with the commandment keepers and how the commandment keepers had some association with mainstream rabbinic Judaism. Well, there's a picture of Ariah at his bar mitzvah, and he later became the leader of the One West school. My point is that there's some leftover rabbinic influence, and they could have been exposed to maybe text or passages like this at some point, because we wonder where did it come from. But there's a key one, and then let me read one more here. This is from the Apocrypha. So if you see a group of guys out on the street and they're holding this specific edition of the Apocrypha,
King James Version,
they like this one. This one is sharp enough to throw at someone to hurt. They got these really sharp corners. They don't use it that way. I'm just saying, but that's the one they like to use. There's a passage in 2 Ezra 6:9. that says Esau is the end of the world and Jacob is the beginning of it that followeth. So they take that to mean white nations will be the last nations in power and control before Yahushua comes back.
Before some restoration.
Yes. Okay, right. And of course, the way it goes like this, the first time I encountered some guys in the street, I said, this sounds really racist. And they said, thank you very much. Yahweh is racist. Read Romans 9:13, Jacob I have loved, but Esau I have hated. See, God loves us and hates white people. So if Esau is Edom, he's hated.
Even though they have the same father, how does that work? How does that work genealogically and biologically?
It's weird they're twins, and one is essentially black and one is essentially white, but they like to point to these news articles that'll show a couple that has one child who is a twin who was dark-skinned and the other one who's light-skinned. So they point to those news articles as justification that this could happen. But it is a little weird.
Even though the text says nothing about that.
No. Well, one justification they use, they say, Genesis 25, another passage, I'm sorry, I forget where it is in Genesis, says Jacob had smooth skin. Mm-hmm. And they'll say a quote that one of the older guys said, his skin was smooth as the black man's invariably is. Saying
right, so smooth means black.
Well, not being hairy.
Not being hairy. Yeah, so there are no hairy black men. I mean, again,
there's always exceptions.
There's a whole lot of exceptions.
So there's some justification for Edomites, and they will not accept, that if you're white, you're not an Edomite when it comes to One Westers. Now, some of the non-One Westers still believe whites are Edomites. Others say, no, they're of Japheth, and the One Westers have a big problem with Hebrew Israelites who say white man is Japheth. Or descendant from Japheth. One other thing about this is sort of just the strangest of all. I don't know if we have time to get the Moabites.
Yeah, let's do some.
Here's Israel. We go like this. We got these Transjordan kingdoms, right. Edom, Moab, Ammon.
Right, so for viewers, Transjordan means, if you're looking at a map, you've got Israel or Canaan on the left side of the Jordan River, and then you have the Mediterranean Sea. Well, on the other side, to the right, of the Jordan. That's the Trans-Jordan. It's the other side of the Jordan. So go ahead.
And those three kingdoms were in traditionally geographical proximity to each other, right?
Yep, right vertically right next to each other.
Here's what's strange. They want us to believe dark-skinned peoples, brown-skinned peoples, whatever you want to call them, populating, name a country, right, of the A&E, ancient Near East, and boop, 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 boop. White people,
right in the middle of that. Yeah.
Chinese and Japanese, because the Moabites are considered to be Chinese and the Ammonites are Japanese. Let me show you briefly why they say this, this is offensive to talk about. I don't know how to talk about it without sounding offensive, not towards Hebrew Israelites, but towards Chinese people.
Okay.
I apologize for having to repeat this information. I'm not joking right now.
Okay.
So if you read Genesis 19, 30 through 38, Lot has incestuous relationships with his daughters, producing Moab comes out of that.
Yeah.
Okay. And Hebrew Israelites proceed to say that Chinese people have a look of a deformed person because of that. And that's why Chinese people...
Because they're the result of incest or something?
Yes, and so because that's their genetic foundation, that's why they look the way they look. I'm not joking. They say it's proof, actually, that they're Moabites.
Right.
And
no wonder they would accept the label of racist, but go ahead.
Yes, they use very strong words.
Yeah.
I'm not going to get more into that, but there's more argumentation to that particular line, but you can just see how utterly ridiculous and, to say the least, offensive it is. Psalm 60, verse 8, and Psalm 108, 9, both declare, Yahweh says, Moab is my washpot. And
what do they do when Jerusalem is a whole?
Well, but
they're Hebrew Israelites. I mean,
you're right, but no, they talk about our people being. I mean, because they speak about the conditions in America being, hey, this has happened because.
Right, but this is God calling His own people a harlot, prostitute, whore.
You're right, but it's different than what you think here.
Spiritual adultery, yeah.
It's different than what you think where they're going to go with this.
Go back to the Moabites.
No, because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking what the text means, because the text is saying Yahweh is. You're thinking what the text means is your problem. You need to not think of what it actually means.
All right, I'll try to shut that.
So yeah, so Moab, my washpot. This is a basin in which I wash off my soiled hands and my dirty feet.
Okay.
And so it's sort of something where it's sort of something contemptuous and it's something that's sort of under you. My understanding of the Moab as my washpot essentially is this is showing subjection in some way. Moab going to be judged, basically. They take it as prophetic evidence for, this is their precept or conclusion or presupposition, not mine, as prophetic evidence for why black Americans enjoy Chinese food. So
you're right, I didn't see
there's
that coming.
stories of old one-westers when they would go out to eat, and one particular guy would always say, while they were at this Chinese restaurant in New York, Moab is my washpot. So there's some of the other justification. Right. Another one is quite odd. Deuteronomy 23, 1 and verse 3. They tie them together.
So this one's odd and the other one was?
Yeah, I don't know. What am I saying here, right? It's a spectrum. So this refers to the exclusion of anyone from the congregation who had their genitals severed. And verse 3 refers to the exclusion of Moabites from the congregation.
Right.
What they do is they tie those two together and then claim that the severing of genitalia is prevalent, especially among the Chinese and Japanese, because of sex reassignment surgery. They say it's prevalent among those populations. And the fact that it happens in those populations proves that the Moabites and the Ammonites are in East Asia.
How could you have sex reassignment surgery in days before there was surgery and anesthesia?
They're saying now that they tie these together for now. You know what I'm saying? Not back then.
But aren't we talking about the origins of these people?
They're talking about, remember, so the Chinese restaurant one is a modern thing. Moab's my washpot is a modern thing.
All right.
They leapfrog a lot of history.
Yeah, well, I can see that, yeah.
And so, lastly, Judges 3:17 describes a fat Moabite king.
Okay.
They argue this parallels.
I can tell you enjoy this one already.
Yeah. I mean, you want to guess? They're all fun. You want to guess this one?
I have given up all hope of being
popularity
able to follow the thought process
of sumo wrestlers and corpulent depictions of the Buddha in East Asia.
Okay.
The fat Moabite king in Judges 3:17. Right. Now again, we could be like, what? But here's what to remember. Once you feel like your identity has been affirmed in this way, The other arguments are really secondary.
Right. You don't need reason when you have that thing that is most meaningful to you.
And they've given a lot more attention to the Edomite-Israelite relationship than to other nations. And what I did just now is I gave you the Edomites and Moabites because, to my knowledge, those are out of the 18 nations of Gentile heathen nations who are unelect, non-elect, whatever. Those are the ones that are most fleshed out. The Edomite one and the Moabite one. The others are much less fleshed out. Like for Arabs, they kind of just say, well, the Ishmael, everyone knows Arabs are Ishmaelites.
In other words, they don't have as detailed of an explanation within their
Yeah, the others are even
community.
less than the two. Edom could go on for a while. They have a lot from Edom, supposedly. But they just haven't given as much thought, and it's just not as important. So there's two of the Gentile nations that they assign.
So basically what we have is we have no attention at all to the original context of Scripture. There's no interest in really looking at it for what it means, especially again in its own context, because all of these things, were reflective and happened in real-time, boots on the ground in antiquity. These are real-time events, even in the biblical storyline. Edom and all that kind of stuff. So that isn't something that the Black Israelite thing really cares about. What they care about is it's this correlation and causation fallacy. And all of that is secondary to the identity that this gives them.
Yes.
That's really what it comes down to.
Yeah, and that's a powerful motivating
factor.
It
is. It is. It honestly is. And if other communities, i.e., let's just be blunt here, if the Christian community has not adequately addressed that need for these people, then we can't blame them. We have to blame us.
Right.
That's what it comes down to.
A lot of these new alternative spiritualities in the city context do that kind of thing. So the Kemetic folks say our ancestors are in Egypt, and Moorish temple science does something different. Nation of Islam is the lost tribe of Shabazz from Mecca. They
the historic cults do this too. This is community building. So.
But it's interesting, a true understanding of actual biblical Christianity would actually allow a person to retain their African identity and be proud of it. Now, it's a shame a lot of people held the name of Christ in America did literally the opposite. And it's a real travesty to what's went down. And, they got the curse of Ham and all this kind of nonsense going on, or the curse of Cain.
It's bad biblical interpretation. We've actually done episodes on Fringe Pop on those topics.
Oh, I'd love to see those.
It's just terrible biblical interpretation.
And it's sad, and it's created a problem. And so a true biblical understanding, though, would allow you to, in fact, the first Gentile convert is in the book of Acts is an Ethiopian. I was reading the other day, and a guy was like, oh, it's Cornelius in Acts 10. I'm like, why is he saying Cornelius? What about Philip with the Ethiopian eunuch? That's the first Gentile convert that I see in the New Testament under the New Covenant. And you have Acts 13. You have someone from Cyrene and someone called Niger, which means black. You have this there, and you have people from Alexandria, which is in Egypt, which is Africa. You have plenty of places to go to say, this is a religion for all people.
There's a long heritage.
And there's not an ethnic hierarchy in it. Unlike Hebrew Israelism.
Right.
So but.
Well, thanks for unpacking some of that. I mean, I know some of it was funny, but it's actually pretty serious. When you get right down to it.
And it affects people's real lives. People's marriages are getting destroyed over this, Mike. There are churches that are being flipped into Hebrew Israelite churches, and there's some kind of weird hybrid churches that are getting split in half. If we did a test, we could share a bunch of horror stories on this if we wanted. But since we've been doing this ministry, me and a bunch of people I work with, sometimes calls ourselves the Shield Squad, and there's other related ministries, Soldiers of God, have seen a lot of people also come out because now they're finally hearing new information, and they have a place to turn to talk about their experience. So it's not all bad, but the church can't go to sleep on this.
All right, well, thanks again, and we'll have you back one more time because I want to discuss one other thing, again, that's really important in relation to their doctrine, things that we need to be aware of. So, we have one more round with Vocab Malone, and we are talking about Black Hebrew Israelites, their beliefs, and sort of evaluating, getting a little bit of analysis there. And this time we want to talk about their view of salvation. So in earlier interviews, earlier times with you, you made some comments about only Israelites, only the Israelites, the real Israelites, the black Israelites, will be saved or are even eligible for salvation. And then the other thought was that, when it really gets down to this, they have a merit-based system of some sort, of earning their salvation in some way. So I want to talk a little bit more about those ideas and, are they coherent in terms of what we actually see in Scripture?
Well, let's look at 4 texts they would use to say salvation is only for Israel and we are Israel. A lot of times when they use these, I'll say, well, you better hope you're interpreting those wrong because I don't think you're an Israelite. You better hope salvation is for Gentiles, which sometimes I just do that to get them thinking because it sort of incenses them. But it's just something to...
Which is useful.
Well, it's just something to get the conversation going. But we have good conversations, though. Don't get me wrong. I've had some great conversations with just recently with a guy in Detroit named Inop, for example. So we have good conversations, but sometimes I'll say that, but we can have fun. So John 4:22, Jesus is speaking to a Samaritan, by the way, which I think is significant.
That is significant, yeah.
And when this phrase is there, salvation is of the Jews, they interpret that to mean salvation is only for the Jews. That's how they work for that. That's how they work that passage. Psalm 147, 19-20 is really big for them. The word of the Lord is revealed only to Jacob, not any other nation. So, hey, the Bible's only for us. So sometimes in a debate, when they're not doing too well, they'll say, hey, the book's not even for you anyway. You don't have any business interpreting that. You can't teach me. And that's not even your book anyway. What are you doing? Why are you looking at my book? Matthew 15:24, Christ is only sent to the lost sheep of the house of Israel is what they point to that understanding of that verse there.
Did you read the verse? Do you have it?
No, I'm paraphrasing the way they utilize it. I'm not reading the actual.
Because I don't think that's what that.
Yeah, that's not what it says. Here, I'll read what it really says, but that's how they. I'm basically showing you how they actually use the verse, not that one I didn't quote. The Psalm 147 one I did quote, but let me read it here. I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, at least in the CSB. But one thing I tell them is, well, let's go to the end of Matthew and make sure Matthew doesn't contradict Matthew.
Yeah.
And Jesus says in Matthew 28, 19-20, go into all the nations.
Yeah.
And they say, well, our people were scattered throughout all the nations, so that just means simply that you pull them out of each nation that they're in. But that's
and Jesus spends lots of time in Galilee, otherwise known in the Old Testament as Galilee of the Gentiles.
Right.
Okay, that's the Old Testament, not the New Testament. That's the Tanakh.
Yeah.
Okay, but anyway, go ahead.
And of course, Acts 1:8, I'll make you witnesses, and
Jerusalem, Judea, all the uttermost parts of the earth.
Right.
Yeah.
And then that's sort of like a table of contents for the book of Acts, because that's what they do. But they say that's because our people are everywhere. This is what they do with those kind of passages. Now remember, they accept the Apocrypha, as I mentioned earlier, as scripture. And there's various reasons, but they find it helpful. And 2 Ezra 6:54-56 says along the lines that all nations other than Israel are likened to mere spit or spittle. And the Apocrypha does say that, they're likened to mere spittle. And so that kind of impulse during Second Temple Judaism shows up in 2 Ezra, and they utilize that to say, well,
all of these things make sense in an Old Testament context. I mean, Israel was the chosen; the others are not chosen. The others are under judgment. What I call the Deuteronomy 32 worldview. Of course, again, but does that situation stay that way is really the more important question, because you have I would be curious. What do they do with Isaiah 66?
Right.
Where you have people among the Gentiles who wind up again in the vision of the future being priests in the temple of Yahweh. I mean that doesn't seem to go very well with what we're talking about here.
Or the passage I read during the break, Isaiah 19.
Oh yeah.
What do you think of that? That's I think that's significant. You got this prophecy, Isaiah, and he's saying that there is going to be worship taking place in Egypt of Yahweh as a covenant God, and speaks also of this 3-part alliance of basically Yahweh's people there. Let me just read this last verse. Isaiah 19:25. The Lord of armies will bless them, saying, Egypt, my people, Assyria, my handiwork, and Israel my inheritance are blessed. I mean, Egypt my people?
Yeah.
Of course, Hebrew Israelites that are the one West variety just say, yeah, that's the Israelites living in those lands. That's but it's clearly not saying that.
Right, it's just not what the text says.
But that's the kind of thing they do. But that's a great passage. Read Isaiah 19, especially verses 16 down to 25. But that's the kind of thing they do. But I also think don't you think we have counter examples of this even in the pages of the Old Testament?
Well, you have the Abrahamic covenant.
Yeah, and what it
all the nations will be blessed, through Abraham and his seed.
Yeah, and I don't think going
Genesis
into slavery or bondage for all eternity, like I think other nations will. I don't think that's being blessed.
Right.
Not only that, but they'll sometimes say, well, if other nations can be saved, we look at the book of Revelation, which of the 12 gates will you enter into? Because it's the 12 tribes of Israel is the idea, and there's no place for you to enter.
Do they realize that those 12 tribe passages in the book of Revelation don't actually include all 12 tribes?
Sometimes we ask them that, and they have these whole explanations to get around it, but they're never very good explanations. So they don't always realize it. Sometimes they don't believe it when you tell it to them. Like, where's this tribe? Why is this list irregular?
Yeah.
And you show them, and then they come up with some explanation. But you also have, sometimes they'll say in response, which one's Enoch going to go through?
No, Enoch's not a tribe, so.
Right, but where would he go? They'll say, well, sometimes I've heard this, he was a proto-Israelite. No joke. Proto-Israelite, so,
So you hear that as an answer to why some of the tribes are missing?
No, I hear that. I was saying how sometimes in response they'll say things like, which gate will you enter into in the kingdom according to the book of Revelation? Because what they're saying is you're not an Israelite. You don't have a door to get into.
I'm tracking.
I was saying they'll say that sometimes in response. They're saying you don't have a door to get into, and I'll say, what door is Enoch going to go through? I mean, not what door, but which door?
And Job. Gate? I mean, Job is from the Transjordan, where all those awful, icky. Well, and it's the Chinese and the Japanese. Or
yeah. Well, Job's interesting because I think it's the Septuagint larger reading, and I think there's evidence I don't know about in the Targums, but there's I'm not saying it's in the traditional Hebrew text, but in like Septuagint, there's this like extra chapter or some extra material in Job, and it says he's an Edomite in there. I'm not saying that's necessarily canonical, but I don't know if you're. They don't like that, of course, as well. But there's that there. Yeah, you got Noah, but even during Israel's day, you have Caleb, you have Ruth, you have Uriah the Hittite. There's a list of people.
Yeah,
you have even Naaman,
even Bathsheba too. In Chronicles, her name is Bathshua, which is a title of a Canaanite person elsewhere. I mean, there are non-Jews, sort of lurking in the. Some of them are pretty transparent. Some of them aren't so transparent.
And there's rules for them in the Old Testament, and a lot of the rules.
Rahab. Why was Rahab allowed into the community?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what they do is just turn them all into Israelites living in foreign lands. That's what they have to do with it. But there's rules, and a lot of the foreigners living among them, if they're really going to be part of the community, took part in the feast days. There was a lot of fairness in the way it's supposed to be applied if they're hanging around. So you have that, but then it gets even harder for them when you get to the New Testament. How are you going to limit salvation to only Israel? Especially in the New Covenant, it's even, I think, more explicit. But the Abrahamic promise is getting played out in real time. And the first one, of course, at least in the New Testament, I mentioned earlier, you got the Ethiopian eunuch. And so you see it in Acts. Then, of course, the ruling in Acts 15.
Sure.
You have this situation where, what do we do with all these Gentile converts? And it's like, don't put all these burdens on them, just don't do this stuff, and we'll be okay with you. And then James quotes this passage from the Old Testament, then he reapplies it, it's like some of the Hebrews just say James went off there in the ruling.
Yeah. Are you saying that the answer isn't, they're not really Jews, or either they're not really Jews or they're not really believers, or they're Jews anyway, so don't worry about it. I mean,
some say James went off.
It just seems like a convoluted
literally says James went off.
Yeah.
Some used to teach back in the day that the Gentiles who thought they were getting included in the community were getting the trick bag. And so there's something developed called the trick bag doctrine. And the trick bag doctrine taught that it is memorable, right? It's an old school word that means a situation that appears favorable, but it's actually a trap. That's what the trick bag is.
So it's a lie?
Yeah, it's a trick bag. So Cornelius in Acts 10 got the trick bag. Was the older teaching of the school. Some of them taught Acts 15 was a trick bag situation where Cornelius might have even been in the room, for example, and basically James is like winking at the other apostles.
So why wasn't that a lie? Why do they not care about their they're believers, the Jews that are being saved, and they're lying to the Gentiles. To me, that sounds like Islam.
Well, yeah, so you're talking about taqiyya. You're talking about
permission to lie.
I feel like I've seen some of that behavior with Hebrew Israelites. So when you get with some Hebrew Israelites, there's honorable men and women among them. So I'm not doing that.
Right.
But I feel like it's almost like anything is justified when it comes to people they perceive as the other. There are groups that operate that, and I've seen it happen. To Zaryak, we had the agreed situation for a debate discussion we were going to have on his radio show. And it was all in email, and I called him, and we talked about it. And then when I actually called, just changed it all, and didn't abide by anything he said he was going to do. And that kind of stuff happens all the time. Sakari has done that to some of my friends a bunch of times. So some of these guys are that way. They're really like that. But here's the big one in Acts, I think that really is a problem for the Hebrew Israelites. Shout out to my friend Faithful to God. He likes to bring this passage out. It's when Paul's before Agrippa. And Agrippa says to Paul, hey, are you going to so quickly make me a Christian? By the way, it's important that he says, a Christian, because some of them don't like that word. And Paul says, I wish before God. So other translations say different ways, but you get the sense of Paul prays to God for Agrippa's salvation. Agrippa is a descendant of Herod. Herod's of Idumea. Herod is an Edomite. Agrippa is an Edomite. And yet Paul's saying, I wish for your salvation, that whether easily or with difficulty, not only you, but all who listen to me today might become as I am. So I'm going to stop right there. There's one more part. So Agrippa, I want you to be saved just like I am. I pray for this. I hope it happens. And everyone inside this room, the Hebrew Israelites think everyone in that room was a Hebrew Israelite. And here's what's so crazy. It goes totally against their eschatology. He says, become as I am, except for these chains. The opposite of the one West hardcore bondage for the nation, eschatology, because that's what they teach. And yet Paul's not saying that. So Hebrew Israelism is not apostolic. They go around with a 12-tribe chart, say, who's your father, what's your nationality? That's not what the apostles and the disciples did in Acts.
Yeah, it's exactly the reverse. It's an inversion. Yeah.
Yes, and so it's not an apostolic religion at all, and it's something that flips a lot of clear, plain New Testament passages on its head, like John 3:16. God so loved the world. They go to a passage in John 17:9 to say world doesn't, where Jesus says, I pray not for the world, and they take that, then they argue that John 3:16 must be referring to a more limited world. Then they go back to Isaiah 45:17 and try to put two places together and say Israel is a world, is what they do. Then they go back to John 3:16 and say, so the world here means the world of Israel.
What about the contrast in something like Romans 1:16 through 18? The gospel is for the Jew first, and then also for the Gentile or the barbarian.
They take that as
the non-Jew.
They take that as, not as the non-Jew, but it's first for Israelites living proper in their culture and way of life, and second to the Hellenized Jews.
Right, so basically they just make it say something totally different.
Yeah, because there is a word for a Hellenized Jew, and it appears in the situation with the giving of the distribution of the food to the Hellenized widows. There's Greek words to describe this, and so that would be the word to employ, but they make Gentile literally be an Israelite, or a lot of times scattered Israelite in a Gentile state of mind. And the question I've asked them is, when contextually do you know which way to determine, because anything damning to the Gentiles, they say it's actual Gentiles. I'll say contextually, how do you know which way to go? I never heard a good answer other than they'll say, well, don't you believe in context? That's where they flip us, accusing them of context. They say, it's contextual. But we all know, thus who deal with them, the real answer is whenever it's favorable towards them, it's real Gentiles.
Whenever it works for them.
I'm sorry, whenever it's actually Israelites who are in a Gentile state of mind. Whenever it's judgment or condemnation, then it's actual Gentiles. That's the answer.
What really strikes me is, one of the Greek words for Gentiles is ethne, the nations. And if you take that back to the Old Testament, to the Septuagint, you get all these nations that are disqualified for salvation. It's the same word. So, and it's not like just once or twice, it's dozens of times.
Right.
So it's very clear what the ethne are. It's these non-Jewish nations. It comes right out of the Old Testament.
I've heard them say, well, Israel's a nation too, so this could be Israel. They'll say it's not even a word Gentile, it's ethne. Ethne can be our nation.
Well, but then you get a pronoun that with the little word our.
Yes, so I've mentioned that because there's a couple places where that appears, but it always has this qualifier that lets you know who it is.
What about when the word Israel occurs opposite ethne?
I don't know. Where's that happen?
Well, Just Septuagint.
Oh, you mean opposite to show that's two different things?
When they're paired, they're two sides of something. They're different. Is the point?
They just say these are are Israelites in a scattered. I'm sorry.
Right.
Now I'm getting scattered Israelites in a Gentile state of mind. But yeah,
right, a Gentile state of mind. So basically, we're reading a text. We're reading text that isn't there. Is kind of where it's at.
Yeah, and if we say that again, that's where they're like, well, the book's not for you anyway. You're not meant to understand it.
Right. So when they're looking at the words, and then other words just kind of pop in there, and we can't see those words.
Well, do you remember?
It's kind of like a paranormal event.
I mean, no, seriously. Do you remember here where we read the children's book on a previous episode, and right when it's quoting Deuteronomy 28, instead of just letting it be verse 68, just go ahead and parenthetically adds bondage. It's like the Jehovah's Witnesses New World Translation when it comes to Colossians 1.
Yeah, it transcends translation to being interpretation.
Christ created all things, and they just slip in the word other. They just put Christ created all other things. It's not in the Greek text. You look at the New World Translation on the Greek side, and other in Greek is not there. But they just go ahead and insert it right there in the English. Like it belongs there.
Enough, I guess, if it works,
Yeah, but I appreciate you having me on, but I do got to say one thing. I don't think I ever want to come back to your show.
Why?
I got to tell you why.
Sure.
Your alien stole my hat and glasses. And I just don't want to put up with that kind of behavior. That Kangol costs a little bit of money, man.
See, and you only noticed it now?
Yeah, well, I was wondering where it went.
He's really good.
He's got my glasses. I couldn't read any of these books. He's got my Kangol on. He just went ahead and I feel totally probed right now.
You can take his underwear when we're done.
Oh, his underoos? Yeah, I saw those. I'll let him keep those. There might be some things in there I don't want to discover.
You had an unusual interest in that earlier. But
yeah,
anyway.
That was a close encounter of the third kind.
I want to end the episode right there just to get you with that. All right, well, thank you for being with us. We did a lot of episodes, a lot of segments. I think this is going to be really instructive for our audience. I know I learned a number of things just sitting here talking to you. So thanks for coming out and being part of Fringe Pop.
Thank you very much, Dr. Heiser.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for watching Fringe Pop 321. Again, go to our website, fringepop321.com. You can get information about this episode and all of our episodes. And if you want to support what we're doing at Fringe Pop, please go to fp321.com/S, as in the letter S, and make a donation. It helps us keep doing what we do. And come back and watch more episodes because what you know may not be so.